All right, it looks like we have our waiting room clearing out here, so we are going to go ahead and get underway. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, How to Analyze Your Insurance Compliance Data, Identify Weak Spots, and Increase Compliance. We're going to be talking today about kind of the phenomenon of compliance that plateaus. We're going to be talking about some real life examples from some of our customers here at Jones. And we're going to be talking about some strategies that you too can implement if this is something that is coming up for you. My name is Margaret Christie, and I am the team lead of the customer success team, as well as a customer success manager here at Jones. Some of you may work with some of my colleagues. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out. Today, I also have joining me my colleague Jessica, and I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Margaret. Hello, everybody. I'm Jessica Lopez. I am the Director of Risk and Compliance here at Jones. I oversee the teams that are responsible for extracting insurance requirements from leases and contracts, and also auditing the certificates of insurance and endorsements against those requirements. I also oversee the policy verification team and have been working with clients for the past 3 years to identify the best strategies for insurance and compliance and basically their insurance program. So it's a pleasure to be here speaking with a broader audience about this and how to analyze your insurance compliance data.
Thank you, Jessie. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. I will also briefly add that this is being recorded, so we will be sharing a copy of this presentation after our call today, as well as some other material that will come up as we move through. So the first thing that we are going to be covering today are 3 reasons that insurance compliance plateaus over time. We have a lot of customers who work here on increasing their compliance rates, and they sometimes see that they hit kind of a point past which they're not able to get traction. So we're going to be talking about that. We're also going to go over some common changes that we see those customers make to their requirements once they've gotten to that place, and some suggestions on what you can do to implement them. We'll take some time to look at some requirements that are constantly problematic for our customers that have them. And we'll talk about a framework that you can use to analyze your requirements to see if these are an issue for you, as well as some ideas for changes you could implement. And then we're going to have some time at the end of our presentation today for you to ask questions and to answer them. If we run over, we would be delighted to follow up with you via email or call. So please feel free to reach out if there's anything we can't cover today. We're also going to take a minute here to talk about some other upcoming webinars. We have customer training. This is just a generic Jones how-to training. So please feel free to join us for that on July 11th. We have some product updates that are going to be rolling out hopefully before then. So we hope you'll join us. Another webinar we have coming up, how to review COIs and endorsements. So those of you who are risk professionals, this may not be exactly geared towards you, but if you have any property teams or project teams who could use some COI basics, want to cover what those different auto boxes mean, if you can use umbrella to supplement different policies, this is a great class for them. Just kind of get learn your way around an Accord 25. And then lastly, we have a little Jones DIY, which is make a waiver guideline sheet. Many of our customers do have rules for instances in which they're willing to accept things that don't meet the insurance requirements in their account. And the best way we have seen to communicate that to different teams is to get those things in writing and share them with the teams that will be implementing them. So we're going to be doing a little how-to. So if you too can make your waiver guideline sheet, those links to RSVP are in the chat, and we'll also be sharing them via email after our call today. All right, so now we're going to get into the meat of our presentation, which is why does insurance compliance plateau? First, I want to talk about compliance in general. What does it mean? In a way, it's a little bit artificial. We are tracking, when we consider insurance compliance, usually how many of the vendors or tenants or subcontractors, trades that you may have that you work with who are able to fully meet your requirements. Now, that could be a little bit artificial. You might have requirements that are not fitted to each individual um, trade or vendor or tenant. Additionally, those requirements are determined in maybe an artificial way. So that's why this can be something that is tricky for people to kind of meet and consider. We're going to talk about some of those factors now. So the first thing to consider is where these requirements come from. Like, who's making them? Usually it is a risk or risk professional or a legal professional. And when contracts are written with requirements or requirements are standardized for companies, they're typically not written from a way that is designed to make them practical or achievable. It's a little bit of, I always like to think of it kind of pots at the wall. They're trying to see how much they can get out of a vendor or a tenant, what all can they cover. The last thing they want is for there to be a liability event and then for someone to turn around, look at them and say, why didn't you have this written into the requirements? So I think a tension that we see with a lot of our customers, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough, is that they are often chasing requirements that are not actually designed to be practical and meetable. So that is one key tension that we see for a lot of our customers. Another key tension comes from the group that's on the ground actually trying to use these requirements, right? If you have teams at a property, teams on a project, they are trying to make sure that they can get vendors, tenants, subcontractors in compliance so that they can run their business, right? They need work to be performed. They need tenants to pay their bills. And so they have to be there trying to achieve this compliance. And that puts them in a little bit of opposition at times with the risk team as they are each trying to kind of meet their own goals here. The third group that we have kind of pulling in this environment is management, usually in the context of real estate or construction, usually somebody who cares about this compliance rate, right? There's someone who wants all of these vendors and tenants to be able to meet whatever standards have been given for, you know, some sort of internal metric, maybe an investor, or maybe if they've been hired to manage properties or projects by someone who is a client, then they may have to meet a certain obligation for compliance rate to that person. So we have kind of three different groups of people pulling in three different directions. And we often find that this creates a lot of tension. It creates upset on behalf of vendors, tenants, subcontractors who feel the requirements are unreasonable. The property teams are frustrated, the risk teams are frustrated, and management's usually frustrated because they're saying, I really need this compliance number to come up. Why can't it? And we're in a position of things sort of not being meetable. So on top of all of that, there are misconceptions about requirements and what role they play in risk mitigation. A lot of requirements may have been created historically, especially in a situation when you have leases. Those requirements may be 30 years old or way out of context with what is current. Additionally, I think we can all agree that a lot of people implementing insurance requirements don't have a lot of expertise in the field. And so they may be enforcing something that even necessarily isn't important. Maybe it would be the case that if the risk team were on the ground with that property team manager, they'd say, oh, you know what? I don't really care about this. The suite number is missing from the certificate holder. I think it's okay. But they may not know that that's acceptable. So this is one of those things that I think exacerbates the situation. So another little plug here for our DIY waiver guidelines webinar. This would be a great moment to clarify those rules so that you can share them with the team. But all of this comes together to create kind of a perfect storm. And so now we're going to move on to talk about kind of when you might want to revisit your requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, even if your property teams are working really hard, but you're not seeing your compliance rate go up, this is a good sign or bad sign, I don't know, a sign that you might want to revisit your requirements. Additionally, if you're having a lot of tension with tenants and vendors, it's common for us to see this when we see companies that we work with really strictly enforcing their requirements. Often when we have customers come onto Jones, they may be enforcing requirements that they didn't enforce previous to having Jones. And so that usually creates some tension, but sometimes over time, as you continue to try to get some of those requirements fulfilled, you may have increased tension with vendors and tenants. And so that's usually a time to say, wait a second, am I asking for something that's just not gettable to them? Can they even buy this? Sometimes these insurance requirements were created, the insurance market's changed, and they're no longer even available for purchase. So everyone's kind of chasing their own tail there. And then lastly, failure to properly allocate liability to a third party's insurance coverage. So if you hear us talking about quote risk transfer on this call, this is what we're talking about, which is making sure that you are transferring risk from yourself onto someone else, hopefully having them take it on, and therefore not having to worry about facing all of these little requirements that come up. All right. Would anyone like to guess the number of customers who have gone through kind of a full revisitation, shall we call it, of their requirements on Jones? If you want to pop into the chat some guesses as to the number of customers who end up doing this, I will let you guess for a little minute here. Don't be shy. You can pop it into the chat if you want. Ooh, we have an bold 80%. Anyone else? All. In a way, that's kind of true. Oh, guesses that are really high. Yes, Jessica, you are very close to the truth there. Mariella, you're also close. It's actually, in this case, the way that we're counting it, 35%. I will say that I guess I asked the question in a really broad way. Most customers, when they come onto Jones, make slight adjustments. They may say, all right, yes, we thought that we were going to pursue this esoteric thing, and we're not actually going to pursue it anymore. But in general, customers who kind of go through that process, and then after making a very sincere effort to chase compliance, come back and end up really reducing their requirements, trimming the fat, it's about 35%. I will say that these usually represent customers who have really been focused on their compliance numbers over time. Some of our customers rely on us to help them flex COIs, keep them current, they don't chase compliance. And then also customers who usually are not completing really, really high risk work. So if you're completing high risk work, you may want to enforce every single little itty bitty thing, because that could be very dangerous to you. But yes, about 35%. So now we're going to talk about some strategies that we use here at Jones to actually implement these changes. So I'll toss it over to Jessie now so she can tell you a little bit about what she does.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret, because I bet they're thinking, how do you do it, right? So how does this change happens? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the customer journey with the compliance team, which is the team that I was telling you guys that I lead. We started with the auditing standards review call. It's a call that we have the opportunity to show our customer how we are going to be auditing the third-party insurance documents that we collect, right? Our standard. So they can decide to be stricter or more lenient. It's basically about addressing the way that the customer feels more comfortable about how they want us to audit these documents. And then they go through the onboarding stage, which is when we start to collect and review all these insurance documents according to the defined rules in the ASR. And after some time, after this happens, we start to flag these gaps. In Jones, we have great features that automate the process of informing the vendors and tenants and subcontractors what the discrepancies are between the requirements and coverage they provided. So after some time, they start to provide new documents, new endorsements, new COIs, and we start to see the trends. After this back and forth happens at first, initially, they're going to have a very low compliance rate. Everybody thinks they have 100% compliance rate. They do not. They will have something close to 5%, 10% sometimes. And it's going to increase with that process of back and forth. And then we see a trend, and that's when the compliance plateaus, because we see that there is a requirement that is killing their compliance, or maybe an auditing approach that is really problematic and requires a lot of case-by-case waivers. So once we identify it, sometimes the customer will do that, realize that they need to reassess their insurance requirements and auditing approach. And sometimes we're also going to offer that to them and say, hey, we realized that right now you need a strategy session, which is what I'm kind of like doing right now with you guys, without all the specifics, of course, of your data. But that's what we do. We go over the customer's data and realize what they need, what can be tweaked in order to see that compliance rate improving in a way, of course, that it doesn't create more risk. We don't want to open our customers to risk, right? We want to make sure that they are protected and that they are handling insurance and compliance applying common sense. So that's the process. Now, this is the list of changes that we see companies making more often. That's the most, those are the most common changes that could be either in the requirement or the auditing approach, or even the way the teams are using Jones as a tool, right? So we have the blanket additional insured adoption. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Listing Jones as a certificate holder and being more lenient with the certificate holder requirement. I think that the certificate holder requirement is one of the biggest misconceptions that we have out there. So we're also going to talk about it. 30 days notice of cancellation, it's such a controversial requirement. Tiering vendors and tenants, removing waiver subrogation and primary and contributory for umbrella, removing the additional insured requirement for automobile liability and being lenient with the auto types, removing property insurance, reassessing liquor liability, and also the way they handle waivers, being more proactive and also enabling the team, the PMs, to apply waivers instead of having a very bureaucratic system to get a waiver approval, right? So this is the list, and you may be thinking, oh my God, this is not for me. Well, probably not everything is for you, but some of it might be. And it's a good way, a good list to start an informed conversation. Of course, some of these things are always a good idea, and some of these things you need to be cautious about and realize if it's something that is applicable for you or not. And we kind of like split them into these two columns to kind of help you as well. Starting off with the certificate holder, it's always a good idea to look at the certificate holder a bit different from what we've seen people doing in the industry. We have people saying, oh my God, the certificate holder needs to be perfect, when the first statement on the COI is that the certificate holder has no rights in coverage whatsoever. And also like notice of cancellation, which is not a requirement that actually provides risk transfer. It's more for you to guarantee that you're not working with an uninsured company. And there are better ways, to do that. Even because notice of cancellation is something that insurance companies typically fail to deliver. And it is the most waived gap in Jones because of it. Tiering vendors and tenants, always a good idea. It's as Margaret was saying, like the legal teams, when they are coming up with the leases and the contracts, they're going to try to put everything in there. But I guarantee you, not all of your vendors, they need crime liability or professional or pollution. And we're talking about expensive insurance coverage here. We're talking about things that it's difficult for the vendor to even acquire. So you're making it super difficult for them to get in and do the job because you're asking things that they don't actually have the exposure in that business. So making sure that you have different levels and sets of requirements according to what they do and the scope of work is also something that is super important. Then, removing waiver subrogation and primary and contributory requirements for umbrella, especially asking to see them in a COI or an endorsement, is always a good idea. I'm going to explain in a few minutes why that is a good idea. And also, of course, do more training. Train the PMs on waiving coverage caps. Allow them to be more independent in that and encourage the consistent usage of waivers to have your compliance rates increasing, because you're going to have the tier, you're going to segment vendors and tenants by risk level, but still some of these requirements may not be applicable for one or their vendor and tenant. That there are always outliers, so waivers are always going to be needed. And then proceed with caution when we're talking about blanket, and why I'm going to tell you in a second, so stick around to understand why blanket isn't always a good idea, although I think it's definitely a solution that everyone should adopt with the condition that it comes with it. Removing additional insured for auto, also, something that it makes sense, and also the being lenient with the auto type, not requiring any auto coverage for everyone. That makes sense depending on all your tenants and vendors area of the scope of work. What is the nature of their company? If there is little auto exposure, of course it is a good idea to always have some type of auto liability there, but is it necessary to be that strict typically it is not. And it's typically a big pain point when people try to be very strict with the auto liability requirements. And remove property when we would say that for tenants, it's not that, it's not really a good idea, because you can be easily held liable for tenants' contents, their property in your building. So it makes much more sense to do that for contractors and vendors, because honestly, why is it important for you? How is it is a risk for you that they have property insurance to cover their own equipment that they are using, right? So the risk there is minimal, and that's why it's just going to help you so much to get the vendors approved if you don't have that requirement. Property insurance is typically a common gap for vendors and contractors. And also liquor, because people, we see liquor liability so often in leases. It's so weird for me that liquor liability is present in so many leases. And the reason is that people may be thinking, I want my tenant to have liquor liability because they may have an event in their unit one day and serve liquor. And what you don't know is that, general liability has some coverage for liquor liability that encompasses those situations. And liquor is really only for people that have liquor as part of their ongoing operations. They serve liquor as part of their core operation. So if that's not the case, you need to reassess enforcing this requirement too. So these are just some things that you can be oriented right now to take a better decision when you're looking at your requirements. And let's now do the deep dive that I was talking about on these 3 items here: AI, waiver subrogation, and primary for umbrella, the certificate holder, and blanket additional insured, starting with the umbrella. So tenants and contractors, they are often required to carry waiver subrogation, additional insured status on a primary and contributory basis for general liability. Like, that's typical. We see that in pretty much every lease, even in the standard requirements for vendors. And I think it's a good idea to have those requirements for general liability, for sure. However, that changes when we're talking about umbrella, because waiver subrogation, and I can just quickly talk about them. Waiver subrogation is the provision that is going to help you to make sure that once the claim is made, the insurer from your tenant and vendor will not try to recover from yourself or from your insurance company. So a waiver subrogation is always a good idea. Primary and contributory is going to make sure that their policy, your tenant's policy and your contractor's policy, is the first in line to pay out and will not seek contribution to have the claim settled. So also a very good idea. In addition, insured, of course, you don't have any access to the benefits of the policy, to the waiver subrogation, primary coverage, and all the policy coverage if you're not an additional insured. So it makes sure that if they are doing work for you, you are covered if a claim happens related to their operations, right? However, it's not a very good idea for umbrella, because umbrella does not have the same nature of GL, auto, employer's liability, and other liability policies. Basically, umbrella mirrors the terms and conditions of the underlying policies, meaning if you pick up an umbrella policy right now and you try to read it, it's not going to have a lot of pages like the CGL policy. And a lot of it's going to just be saying that whatever the underlying policies have as a coverage, they also will replicate it. So we're talking about umbrella following the same forms, terms, and conditions of the underlying policies. And therefore, umbrella does not have their own separate endorsements and its own terms and conditions, correct? So when you're asking for a waiver subrogation endorsement for umbrella, a primary and a contributory endorsement, an additional insured endorsement for umbrella, most likely you're not going to get it, because the insurers will not issue these separate forms and provisions specifically for umbrella because of the nature of the umbrella policy. So explicitly requesting it is going to make it extremely difficult to achieve compliance. So every time any customer tried to enforce these requirements like this, they ended up going to a different route of asking to see evidence that umbrella follows form, because that's typically 99% of the umbrella policies will be on a follow form basis. And then they went from like a very low compliance rate to a much better for sure. And I have some real examples here that we can look at. So that's the umbrella part. I do want to move on to the certificate holder. So why is the certificate holder such a big misconception? The certificate holder is an entity that is typically the entity name and the address are going to be listed on the certificate of insurance, and they are responsible to receive proof of insurance. So it's to whom the certificate is being issued, right? And the primary purpose of that is that you make sure that if any big alterations or if the policy is canceled, that address and that entity is going to get mail informed by the insurance company that something happened. The insurance was altered or it was canceled, right? In reality, however, it doesn't actually happen like that. And unlike the additional insured, the CH does not have coverage under the insurance policies listed on the certificate of insurance. They are only entitled to be notified about the status of the policy, and that many times doesn't even happen, as I was explaining. Margaret was saying that sometimes these requirements they change because the industry changes, and I think that notice of cancellation is one of those requirements that early back in the day it was something that everybody could easily add to the policies and the certificates. And it became something that it's not that easy anymore. Even the accord forms changed to not include a number of days for notice of cancellation anymore, and only has kind of like a broad cancellation term that doesn't actually tell you anything, doesn't commit to actually give you anything, just that they're going to try to do it, right? So the additional insureds, on the other hand, they receive coverage, they receive protection, and insurance companies are going to be more responsible with what they have to offer to the additional insured with what they have to offer to the certificate holder. So it may look like being a certificate holder provides some level of assurance, but it does not offer the substantial legal and financial protection that come from being an additional insured. So the certificate holder, in the end of the day, has little relevance in risk mitigation. So we see a lot of our customers being successful when they adopt an approach where, if everything else in my COI is compliant, the only outlying issue here is the certificate holder. Let's not keep somebody not compliant and, increase the not compliance rate because of a certificate holder gap. Here is an example of what I was saying. The certificate is issued as a matter of information only and confers no rights upon the certificate holder. So even though it's in bold letters, some people forget about this. And right now, we just started to push for this education with our customers. It's been, I think, about 3 months since we started to offer to be the certificate holder listed in the COI. And already we've seen 27 Jones customers adopt this approach where we are the certificate holder and where we can be more lenient when auditing this requirement as well. And lastly, I want to talk about the additional insureds. So I'm going to talk about listing the additional insureds on the COI because I think everybody thinks that's so important, right? And I don't even want to ask that question, but how many of you don't even have contracts with some of the people getting in your property, but you make sure they have a COI where your name is listed on it, and then you feel safe. You feel like, oh, that's okay. We don't have a contract with them, but they provided a COI, and my name is on that COI. Well, newsflash, that doesn't mean you're covered. I am sorry for be the one that is breaking the news for you, but being listed on the certificate of insurance is typically coming from a place where the broker, they know that the blanket language exists on the policy. And blanket language is this: any person or organization required by written contract is an additional insured. So they are coming from a place where if they are required to carry this person as an additional insured, they have a contract in place. So because they have a contract in place, they have a blanket additional insured endorsement in the policy, I can definitely add that wording on the COI. So that's the logic that we see agents and brokers having. And we know that because, maybe you never realized that was an issue, but when your name is listed on the COI and the wording is, are additional insureds where required by written contract, it's limiting the coverage here to the existence of a written contract. So the AIs listed there actually do not mean that they are individually scheduled on an endorsement to be part of the insurance coverage of that policy, right? And however, so as I was saying, if a contract doesn't exist and the entities, even though the entities were listed on the COI, the coverage doesn't actually exist. Now, for blanket AI, any person or organization required by contract is an additional insured. That wording is so common to see on COIs, so common to be attached to COIs in some endorsements. So what we see is that if you have a contract in place, if you have an agreement, and they have this wording on a COI or they have this wording on an endorsement, then you have coverage. You don't actually need to see your entity name listed on the COI to make it relevant for you. You already have a contract and that language is referring to the contract. So it's even better than having your name listed on the COI and you are not actually sure that this was actually endorsed separately, right? So we are really believers that Blanket AI can make it so much easier to manage insurance and make compliance rate better because it's a very common language, as I said, on insurance documents, and because you have no idea. I think you have an idea, maybe, but we're looking at like 10,000 COIs every week, for 15,000 COIs at this point. And it's so obvious that brokers and agents, they are very sloppy sometimes. They will have a lot of things misspelled, even though the requirements are really clear. And that creates so much back and forth. Getting them to fix those misspellings is such a hard job and a lot of time wasted. So once you rely on Blanket, you don't have that work anymore. You know that you have a contract that is listing perfectly the entities that are required, or they are clear about what entities have coverage on your insurance, and then you can just relax that you have coverage because of your contract, the contract that you have in place. And I think the question for you right now is, do you have contracts with everyone? Do you have a system where you make sure that you have contracts with everyone that is entering your property, an insurance requirements agreement? And, if you don't, you have to figure out a way to do that. And I know that in Jones, we have a very good alternative. And I want Margaret to demo that for us, to show us how you can manage your agreements and make sure that you have agreements with everyone getting into your property through Jones.
Thank you, Jesse. Yes, I'm going to take a minute to go ahead and share my screen and see if I can show you a little bit of what this looks like in Jones. So I have a test property here in Jones, and we have records in here. And we can see as I scroll, this particular record, LM Electric Inc., actually has an issue marked for their agreement. Some of you may never have seen this kind of requirement in Jones before, or maybe if you don't currently use Jones, you definitely haven't seen it, but I can open this record and we can take a look. So this is what it looks like as a requirement in our system. You can see here that we have marked as missing the insurance, the agreement, the indemnity agreement here. And we do have customers set this up in our system. So basically the way it works is you give us the agreement that you would like to have added to the specific requirement. And then this is actually something that is sent to the vendor or tenant or subcontractor as they move through the process of uploading things into the system from Jones. So it works the same way they would be uploading a COI into Jones. The agreement appears from them, and then they're able to actually electronically sign it as they move through the upload flow. So you can see here, you're able to actually view the requirement, you're able to view what they've signed, and we have a number of ways we can set these up, as well as the number of ways that we're actually able to check them. And so you can see, I'll show you an example here, what it looks like when we have a correct one as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that Jesse can take that over.
There we go. So much easier. I know the contracts and managing contracts can be such a pain, and to be able to have a team that will review that for you and an easy flow for the vendors and tenants as well to comply with that, it makes it much better. So let me share my screen again and go to my next slide, which is the problem with some endorsements when it comes to blanket additional insured language, which is what we call contractual privity language. So you got to make sure that, maybe you have contracts in place, and then you have this process where you decided to adopt blanket additional insured language, and not every blanket endorsement is going to be a good idea for you. So some endorsements, this is an example that is from the CG 2033 endorsement. It's a non-endorsement to have contractual privity language. And sometimes even in endorsements that are like CG 2010, CG 2037, they are endorsements that have a schedule box where brokers can fill with whatever information they want. So you got to be really alert, because sometimes the language they put there could include contractual privity language, which is saying any person or organization for whom you're performing operations when you and such person or organization have agreed in writing. So what this language means is that the contract may list everybody that needs to be an additional insured, but they are only providing coverage to the signing parties. So if not all of the additional insureds that were listed in the contract signed the contract, they don't have coverage. So in Jones, when we see this language right here, we push back and we flag this as a coverage gap that they need to fix. Something like this: additional insured endorsement must not contain contractual privity language. If it's a schedule endorsement, as it's the example of the CG 2010-07-04, they could definitely alter the schedule box to make it in a way that it's not limiting the coverage only to the signing parties. But if the additional insured endorsement is by its nature limiting coverage, as is the case of the CG 2033, they are going to have to issue another endorsement to provide coverage to everyone listed in the contract, and not only the people that signed that contract. So I just wanted to put this out there, because contractual privity language is something that we see insurance companies doing these days in an attempt to not give coverage to everybody that contractually is required to have coverage. Now, we have a mention of a customer. Margaret, do you want to share with us a little bit of the customer's perspective here?
Yes, absolutely. We have one of our customers here, Julie. I actually see some folks from Manhattan on this call, so hello. And she was kind enough to share a quote here with how they have decided to use blanket endorsements. And it's definitely been something that is effective for them, as they not only look to increase their compliance numbers and make sure that they have everything the way they need it, but also to make sure that they're actually getting the best coverage that they're able to get. I think the great thing about this particular change that you can make to your requirements is not only does it make it easier for you to, in a lot of ways, get what you need to make sure that someone's compliant, but it's also actually better for you from a risk perspective as well. So kind of a win-win there.
Exactly. So, with all that said, let's take a look at some real life examples. We just saw this quote from Julie. I think that Manhattan, they already had very good approaches to insurance when they joined Jones, and some customers will learn that as we go. And these are some examples, starting with a Seattle-based real estate company. They started with some strict requirements, and the certificate holder, we had a very strict approach to it. They did not accept blanket wording, and they had 30 days notice of cancellation as a requirement within CGL. And look at their data, right? So you see certificate holder rates increasing significantly once they decided to have Jones as the certificate holder, and also be more lenient when it's the last remaining gap. They started to accept blanket additional insured language. And look, again, this difference here is the result of, as I said, some brokers not being that careful when having a lot of misspellings. And then, we just see the wording, the blanket wording, so much more often in COIs and endorsements that makes it really easier to make sure that you have additional insured coverage. And then it stopped flagging 30 days notice of cancellation as a gap. And, looking back even at what like Julie said here on the quote, they did not stop requiring in the contract 30 days notice of cancellation. All they did was, choosing not to enforce it in the COI, which is different. In the contract, they still need to make sure that they provide notice of cancellation, but if it's not on the COI, that's all right, because typically it's not gonna be. And that's what happened right here. We see a CGL. So all this difference here from, the 56% compliance to the 80% compliance was solely because 30 days notice of cancellation was always the outstanding gap on the CGL coverage. And then they went from 61% compliance rate, which is already significant, to 74, which is, much, much better. Our second success story is even greater, in my opinion, because they decided to remove property insurance for the vendors. They are a New York-based owner-operator. They removed property insurance requirements for vendors. And they went from 39% to 100%, of course. They removed the waiver subrogation and primary and contributory requirement for umbrella. And that's where we see the big jump right here, because of the nature of umbrella follows form was something that was easy for brokers to state on the COI, because that's the nature of umbrella policies, instead of asking for the waiver subrogation and the primary and contributory language to be included, or the endorsement to be attached to the COI. So they went from 15% to 71% compliant with the umbrella requirement. And then lastly, stopped flagging 30 days notice of cancellation as a gap as well. And they went from 62% to 81% compliant in CGL, leaving a 32% aggregate compliance to a 64%. So, and as the vendors and tenants, they get more used to the process of providing insurance information to Jones, I feel like the compliance rate can continue to improve over time, as long as the process continues to be streamlined. So these are two good examples of what, reassessing your insurance requirements and the way you audit the requirements can do for you, can make a difference in your portfolio. Even because, again, as I was saying in the beginning, we're not trying to open our customers up to risk. They're not trying to do that either. So when we have those conversations with the risk teams, we're having the conversation of like, how can we do this better in a way that it doesn't open you for more risk, but it also allows you to have compliance rates that actually represent the amount of risk that you're taking. Now, here's a framework. So get ready to understand how you can replicate this, how you can run an analysis of your requirements and compliance data and identify potential changes for your company too. So if you're a Jones customer, just get in touch with your CSM and we'll take it from here. We're going to run everything for you. All we're going to have to do is find a day and a time that we can meet and go over it so you can take the decisions. But maybe you want to try to do this on your own. And a very important thing that you have to have is data. So if you have data, you can run an analysis. That's something that for you to analyze your portfolio, you have to have very organized and clear data. So in Jones, you can pull reports for compliance by requirement, waivers by requirement, compliance per project or property. And we have a tool as well internally where we can do this for our customers to run a coverage gap analysis. It's very automated. It's just taking us like 5 minutes to get it done and then review the data that comes out of it. But, maybe if you don't have Jones, but you have data, you can still try to do that on your own. It's just going to take you a little bit more time. But after you do that and you analyze, this is typically the pain point here every time I try to push back, or the place where the tenants and vendors are coming from, always complaining about this requirement. So you can have a conversation with your risk team. But then there's scenario number 2, which is when data is not accessible for analysis. You don't have all that information. So what do you do then? Now, the 3 things that you can do to make your life a little bit better is, first of all, segment vendors by risk or scope of work. Like that's the first thing, because as Margaret was saying, like the contracts will be filled with requirements that are not applicable for everyone in your portfolio. Now, second, you have to take a look at the common changes that are happening in the industry. We're giving you this list because we have so many customers, we're auditing so many COIs, so we can see the trends in the industry, probably in a wider perspective than you can. So get that list to have an informed conversation with your risk team. And third, implement the waiver guidelines, provide training to the PMs, encourage the usage of waivers on a case-by-case basis. Now, I want to quickly take a look at, segmenting vendors by scope of work. In Jones, you can easily do that because you can have requirements set by type of company. So we have here consultants, professionals. For instance, if we're talking about consultants, professional liability is going to apply for them. So there's going to be professional liability required there. But if we're talking about demolition, it's most likely not be something that they need, but they are going to need something like pollution, right? They are more open to pollution exposure. So maybe even demolition and design build will have the same types of requirements, but you can set it up separately, even though it's the same requirement type, just because it's going to make it easier for your team to choose the right set of requirements based on the vendor that they are adding to the portfolio. And another option is also, if they are a little bit more comfortable with understanding what is the level of risk of a project or a vendor, you can choose by level of risk too, and you can set it up low risk or medium risk plus pollution, high risk plus professional. You can have all these different requirement types as well. The common changes that we were talking about, just get this list, take a screenshot, save it, and make sure that you use this, because that's the industry talking here. It's not Jones. It's what we see people coming to us and saying, yeah, it makes sense that we do this. These are the common stuff that are happening, the common discussions that we are having. So you can also try to use this and identify which ones of those 10 are applicable for you. And lastly, this amazing waiver guide. We came up with this PDF that includes a lot of the information, why and when you should apply a waiver, waive something, waive a coverage cap. And, if you join the webinar that we're having the end of July, it's going to be even better, because you're going to learn how to take this waiver guide and make it personalized to you and your requirements, really craft it and make it really specific for your team. So this PDF with also the other webinars information are going to be attached on the email that we're going to be sending to all of our attendees later today. And that is it. I hope that all this presentation was helpful for you guys to make sure that you can analyze your portfolio, your compliance program, your insurance program, and take decisions that take into account common sense and are aligned with both protecting you from risks, transferring the risk from you to the third party, but still making it in a way that you can still get vendors to work for you and tenants to locate units on your building.
Thank you so much, Jessie. We now are going to take some time to answer your questions. So Jessica and I will hang on for a little minute here and let you go ahead and add any questions you may have into the chat or into the Q&A section, and then we will answer them. So I'm going to go on mute for a little second here, give you a minute or two to type them in, and then we'll start answering them. Okay, I see some questions start coming in. So we have a question here. Hi, what number would be considered to be a good compliance rate? This is such a good question. And I was actually thinking as we were going through that it would be useful maybe to plan a webinar in the future about how people could maybe benchmark or set expectations. As Jessie mentioned, right now we're doing about 15,000 COI reviews a week. And so we see a lot. To give you some context, I will say, as Jessie mentioned as well, that usually when we see customers coming on to Jones, we see them start really low, sub 5%, sub 10%. I've seen customers not infrequently start on Jones with even like sub 1%. So I would say that we see this really commonly. And a lot of it is related to what Jessie was saying, which is that a lot of customers, when they come to us, don't actually enforce a lot of requirements that are sort of built into these contracts and leases. And then when they come onto Jones, all of a sudden they're enforcing them. And oh my goodness, everyone is a little surprised by what is coming out. So there's that. I would say the kind of initial culling usually helps. And then to kind of further answer your question, it's very dependent on the industry. I would say some of our construction customers have really, really high compliance rates. You're talking in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I would say it's absolutely never realistic to expect a compliance rate of 100%. If you are chasing that, you will absolutely never meet it, which I think is one of those things that's so frustrating, because when customers come onto Jones, we usually ask, okay, what did you mean? What were you looking for when you bought Jones? What's your goal here? They said, well, we want 100%. And it's not realistic. You're always adding new vendors, new tenants, new subcontractors, and it's just kind of never going to be quite exactly there. So it's a little bit of variance. To be more specific, which you would probably really like, for real estate, I would say I see kind of an initial goal that's really reasonable at about like 40-45% as you're getting started. I think in the first 6 months, year, depending on how much time you'd like to allocate to your teams to work on this, I say that's kind of a good initial goal. Start there and then do what Jessie's saying, which is review your requirements, see what you can go from there. You'll probably have to revisit and maybe let some things go. And once you've done that, I think you then have the possibility of getting really high up there. But again, compliance percentage is artificial. It is how often you're meeting all of your requirements. And if you're making your requirements something that isn't meetable, then you're going to be stuck. So I hope that I know it's a little bit of a complex answer. I hope it was useful. And if you have specific questions about benchmarking, feel free to reach out to, if you have a contact here at Jones, that contact. And if you don't, feel free to reach out to Jesse or myself, and we can go over that. I have another question. How long does it take Jones to bring a sub from initial notice to compliant? Oh, I hate to give you these kind of answers that are so flexible, but it depends on how much you want it, right? I mean, we have some customers who are able to get things turned around in a day really quickly. It depends how complex your insurance requirements are. And then something that I always say is not all brokers are equal. Some of them are really, really good and they're going to get it turned around. They're going to understand requirements. And then sometimes we have emails from brokers that say, Jones is really silly. They're telling us that this is not correct. I look at the requirements and I'm seeing that they didn't even check the statute box on, workers' compensation, and they're kind of yelling at us and saying, "What are you doing here?" So, it depends on a lot of factors. I would say if you're really on it, you can usually get it turned around really fast. But if you have a situation in which a vendor is really small, your insurance requirements are really tight, and they happen to have a broker who's not responsive or maybe not the most experienced, then it can be really challenging. All right, I have another question. Would a blanket additional insured endorsement cost the insured more than individual coverage per additional insured? That is such a great question, and it's actually one that we get here a lot. So I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to ask Jesse to step in as well. If your vendor, tenant, subcontractor is really large, they probably already have this. They definitely already have that. Why? Think about it from the perspective of their broker. If this is a really large company, do they want to be issuing COIs with individual scheduled names on everything? No, absolutely not. It would not be worth their time. So they already have it. We're already good. If you're working with kind of a mom and pop shop or something smaller, then yes, it can cost them more in some cases or be more difficult to obtain. But the thing about it is I think it's becoming more and more common. So we're seeing this kind of as a trend in the industry in general. But Jesse, do you have anything to?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that if you think about vendors, it's always going to make sense that for them, it's going to be easier to have a blanket additional insured because exactly of what you described, they are going to be working with a bunch of different companies, right? The tenant, as Margaret said, if we're talking about a very large company, then yeah, they already have it. But if it's a small tenant, probably they're going to prefer to just issue you that one schedule endorsement, which by the way is not a bad thing. Schedule endorsements are great if they have all the specific information. The issue is that sometimes we see schedule endorsements without the necessary information, and then that's when we go back to, coverage doesn't exist. So yeah, blanket will be something common for vendors, and depending on the tenant, it may be something that you should just accept the scheduled additional insured endorsement.
Yeah, I think that a lot of our customers who accept blanket accept both, right? They'll accept an additional insured endorsement or they'll accept blanket, and so they'll take it either way. And that's something that I think we would encourage here. When Jesse was speaking earlier about seeing names listed on a certificate of insurance, a COI, and those not necessarily being evidence of coverage, we were just talking about things written in the description of operations. Of course, if you have a schedule in an additional insured endorsement, then you're good to go. But as Jesse mentioned, getting it all spelled right, getting everything I's dotted, T's crossed can be a real headache. So we have another question here. I feel we'd want to know if the vendor's insurance was canceled because the vendor would no longer be compliant. Can you tell me how helpful it is or not to require a 30-day notice of cancellation endorsement? Here's the thing. I totally understand the importance of receiving these cancellations. And there are some brokers or insurance companies that are good about sending them out. We also find that a lot of them don't send it. Even if they have an endorsement, they're just not doing it. And at the end of the day, if if you can't get them to do it, then it may not be something that's reliable for you. I think this can be another situation in which instead of an or, it's an and. So just like the blanket and accepting an additional insured endorsement, we can say here that you might require a 30-day notice of cancellation endorsement, but it doesn't mean you have to enforce it, right? Those are two different things.
Exactly.
You can have it in your requirement, but if you don't get it, then you can decide not to pursue it. So I think that that's really a key here. A lot of our customers who decide to make these changes to their requirements may or may not actually make the letter change on whatever requirement they're handing out to vendors, tenants, subcontractors. They may just change the way that they are accepting these things. So I think that that is really key. Another detail here is that increasingly, speaking of industry trends again, we find that vendors and tenants, subcontractors may not even be able to purchase it. There are a lot of companies that won't even sell it anymore. And so that is kind of an additional problem. I don't know if you had anything to add, Jesse.
Yeah, just that, as you said, you may be chasing something that is not actually going to turn into something that the expectation that you have is that they are going to provide you the notice. The reality is that they are not going to. And the idea of having that as a requirement, but not enforcing it is, in my opinion, a good one, because you have, especially endorsements, the new endorsements for 30 days notice of cancellation will say something like this: within 30 days notice of cancellation, after 30 days notice of cancellation. So what is the difference? Like, you want prior notice, so you make sure that you're not working with this person. So I think that it's really common for insurance companies now to find ways to comply with the notice of cancellation requirement. And in the end of the day, the common cancellation statement in the COI should be sufficient to help you. They're not gonna cancel the policy, and you're not gonna know about it the same way if you have that wording on the COI or not. So that's, I think, the issue here, having that as a gap that you're just trying to a coverage gap that you're trying to resolve, that's not actually going to protect you from risk.
And I think additionally in this situation, use good practices around reviewing COIs, which are things that we do here at Jones. For instance, if you have an endorsement that someone's giving you, doesn't match the policy number of the policy on the COI, right? There are some things that you can do. Usually when we talk about policy being canceled, I think we can all acknowledge we're talking about kind of cancellation for nefarious purpose here, or maybe they're, gave you a COI and then canceled it later, or whatever the case may be. I would say, there's a lot of kind of common sense things that you can do just to see if they match up. As with all of this, it's the Swiss cheese method, right? You are stacking slices of Swiss cheese that have holes in them with the hope that eventually with the next thing stacked, you won't be able to get through. And so I think all we can do with these layers is just kind of best practice, best practice, best practice. And then, accept the risk that anytime we walk out onto the street, we could be in danger of getting hit by a car or whatever the case. It's the same thing here. We're at some point accepting some risk. And of course, balancing your requirement with what is feasible for you to actually collect, which is always a little bit of a challenge, but we have to do that. Yes, I have a question here about the recording. We will be sending it out afterward. Last question. My service agreements do not name additional insureds. If additional insureds are in the description of operations, is blanket endorsement for additional insured still okay? I think we talked about this a little bit, but Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that would not be a good idea. Actually, your service agreement, not listing the AIs, having the AIs in the description of operations box does not, it's what I said, it still doesn't mean that you have coverage, especially if the broker that issued that COI was thinking about the blanket wording they have on the policy, right? So the only way for you, Lisa, to be protected here is with a schedule endorsement where in the schedule box, the AIs are listed there. That's the only guarantee that you have because your contract is not tight enough. So what I would recommend you is you don't need to care about the AIs on the description box, but you should edit your contract, your agreements, and include the AIs there and trust on blanket. Make sure that your contract is perfect, and then blanket will be sufficient. You don't need the AIs. I know that's probably a little bit too harsh on my end. Maybe you're scared to do that, but the AIs on the certificate is not going to do much for you. But the schedule endorsement will, and the contract with the blanket wording will as well.
Okay, we have one more question here as we're circling the end. Do you have any insight on how to pursue compliance when you have an emergency on your property? One thing that we kind of touched on at the beginning, but didn't really spend too much time on is that what do we mean when we talk about risk? I just said that every day when we step out of our houses, we accept the fact that the sky could fall, there could be an earthquake, anything could happen, right? And we all accept a little bit of risk to go on with our lives. Can I eat this oyster? Can I get in this car? Can I get on this plane? We all have to kind of accept that bad things can happen. And so if you have a situation with an emergency on your property, you may have to forego some of those requirements because you just need to get someone there. I would say that this is a case in which those contracts can really, really help you because you don't have to wait for them to call their broker, necessarily, whatever. If they're able to just sign the contract in the moment and kind of proceed from there, this I think can be really useful. But Jesse, I'm not sure if you have anything you'd like to add.
That's it. You said it perfectly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to answer your questions, spend some time talking about this. We will be sharing this recording with you after our call today, as well as some of the resources that we mentioned. Please join us in the future for our other webinars. And if you have any ideas for webinars that you would like to see moving forward, if there's something we talked about that is specifically interesting to you, please let us know. We love feedback and would be delighted to plan some future webinars around some things that would be helpful. So with that, have a good rest of your day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.